So here we go. So hello and a warm welcome to this integrity talk on citywide inclusive sanitation, better projects through integrity. This is a joint event between the Water Integrity Network and SUSANA, the Sustainable Sanitation Alliance. My name is Ivan Zupan. I'm the program manager at WIN, and today we'll be moderating this session. We're very glad that you have taken the time, both panelists and people in the audience, to be with us. As you already know, this talk will be recorded, and we thank you for the permission for that. After the integrity talk, we always publish a small summary with key findings and some clips, so you can still listen in to some of the bits. A couple of housekeeping details before we begin. We would like to ask you to keep yourself muted when you are not speaking. We encourage you to write down your questions. This is a conversation. So questions and ideas are most welcome in the Q&A box, which we will find at the bottom right-hand corner of your screens. Please introduce yourselves in the chat box so we know who is in the call and where are you from. This is all. These are all the housekeeping announcements, and we are ready to start. Cities across the globe are growing rapidly. By 2030, it is foreseen that more than 55% of the population in Asia will live in urban areas, whereas in Africa, in the same period, the urban population will increase by additional 360 million dwellers. With higher population densities and urban expansions, managing the vast amounts of human waste is becoming even more challenging. Business as usual in urban sanitation primarily focuses on centralized conventional infrastructure, which only benefits a small percentage of the population. The problem is that we don't have time or resources to wait 50 years or longer for cities to expand their sewage systems and to make on-site sanitation fully functional. What is not helping is the fact that the regulatory, policy, and investment focus has traditionally been on water rather than on sanitation. Technological innovations and new infrastructures are all important steps, but this will always be subject to poor management, corruption, and wasted resources if integrity and good governance measures are not in place. At the end of the day, what we all want to see is that the vested powers and resources are used ethically and honestly for the delivery of sustainable and equitable sanitation services. So today we are talking about sanitation in urban areas, or citywide inclusive sanitations, CWIS in short. This is a rather recent concept that still hasn't acquired a universally agreed definition. At the core of CWIS is the idea that safe, inclusive urban sanitation fundamentally protects the public goods of health and the environment, irrespective of the hardware used to meet that need. Truth being said, integrity within sanitation is often overlooked. Much of the sector's efforts to date have focused predominantly on water integrity risks over and above sanitations. At WIN, we are currently trying to close this gap by looking at integrity risk within CWIS and working with sanitation stakeholders on finding solutions. And so this first webinar on this important topic is an excellent occasion to introduce the basic concept of CWIS and some of its underlying assumptions. As we progress through the conversation, you'll see that we are bringing in some elements of integrity, either by looking at some of the possible approaches, but also cases where examples from the field. I'm very honored to be joined here by CWIS experts in different domains who will be sharing their experiences and knowledge. So thank you already in advance for your time. We're going to be starting now with the first presenter. We have Christoph Lüthi. He works at EWAC Sandeg. He's the head of Department of Sanitation, Water and Solid Waste for Development at the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, long name. He's known globally as a CWIS expert, and he will be talking us through some of the basics of CWIS and provide insights into the CWIS framework. So, floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Ivan, and thanks for the introduction. So I'll get straight to the matter and share my slides with you. I'm going to give a quick overview of CWIS for mostly the people who have only heard of it in passing, and give you an introduction what the concept is about. So CWIS today is the dominant paradigm for achieving safe sanitation for urban contexts, and it is trying to answer or giving answers to the global water crisis. And that is manifested in three different forms. So too much water in terms of flooding or weather-related disasters, too little water for areas that are water stressed in drought, or for most cities of the global south with too polluted water. And 80% of wastewater in these cities today reaches the environment without treatment. And CWIS actually tries to address these issues, and especially the hundreds of millions of urban citizens who do not yet enjoy safe access to basic services like water and sanitation, like the image shows here from Mumbai in India. CWIS is actually not that new. It pulls together learnings from the past few decades and tries to come up with a coherent set of actions. It's a framework. It's not a set approach. I think that's important to mention. But it brings together fundamental propositions that are accepted by the international community, and it provides basic guidance on how to move to action. There are 6 guiding principles that define the framework, and I'd like to introduce them shortly. First and foremost, equity. The equity principle basically touches on leaving no one behind. Everybody can benefit from equitable, affordable, and safe sanitation services. Secondly, environment and public health. Making sure that human waste is safely managed across the entire sanitation service chain, from the toilet all the way to reuse and disposal. Thirdly, the mix of technologies. This is from learnings in the past that sewered solutions are not the only solution, and we plead for a mix of technologies in the same city, depending on the context and where they are most appropriate. Comprehensive planning, making sure that planning is inclusive and holistic, and that participation is taken seriously with the different stakeholders involved. Monitoring and accountability. I guess this is one of the points we'll be covering a bit more in detail in today's session. And then lastly, mix of business models, looking at who does what and where does the funding come from, what kind of financial mechanisms do we need to reach all members equitably. In 2020, we tried to pack these 6 principles into one working definition, and here we go. CWIS is an approach to urban sanitation where all members of the city have equitable access to adequate and affordable improved sanitation services through appropriate systems of all scales, sewered and non-sewered, without any contamination to the environment along the entire sanitation value chain. So that tries to bring those 6 principles into one operational definition. And what we've been seeing in the past few years is the start of this whole exercise was 2016, a conception workshop held at Emory University in Atlanta, then a call for action in Stockholm in 2017. In 2018, the first $1 billion was put on the table for funding CWIS programs worldwide. 2019, principles that I just mentioned were agreed upon. And then 2020, the first publications that we also co-published at EAVAG in Frontiers in Environment. In the last 2 years, we've seen increasing number of pilot implementations of CWIS, and also a move to try to operationalize CWIS. So this, for example, here is from the Gates Foundation, which divides CWIS outcomes. You can clearly see them from the principles, the equity, safety, and sustainability outcomes, and CWIS functions at city level, at state level, but also at national level that allow a CWIS service framework to put into action. Then also some work has been done on trying to create indicators. How can we measure the progress for CWIS? And here are some examples that were developed for principle number 1, the equity. So possible indicators here could be percentage of population with access to improved sanitation, or the percentage of the slum population with access to improved sanitation, or the percent of population with access to improved shared sanitation. You can see this is not a fixed set of indicators, but gives you an indication how we can measure progress on equity. And then if we look at where we are today, I think we can safely say CWIS is accepted as the urban sanitation framework that most big and large donors are aligning with. Research, development banks, NGOs are collaborating to develop and further operationalize CWIS. And of course, this webinar is also one example of that. And I think CWIS is constantly evolving, and there's scope for everyone to contribute to this new agenda. I did some internet search yesterday. These are 3 examples that I came up with that you can find on the internet. So 2 from ADB, a big program that was launched in Indonesia last year on Citywide Inclusive Sanitation, and a new project that IRC has just launched together with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we do see the concept is gaining traction, and we are seeing a lot of new donor and other funding moving into this area. And that was it from my side. Thanks.
Thank you, Christoph. I do not see questions in the chat, so I'll just as a reminder that you can either post your questions in the Q&A, there's a tab at the bottom, or directly into the chat. I suggest we continue because anyway, when we finish this first round of presentations, we're going to come back. We have questions for you, and there's going to be lots more interaction. But I want to now move to the next speaker for today, Claire Grisafti. She's the Global Programs Advisor at Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor. And we know that Claire has been providing some support to utilities on the implementation of the CWIS approaches. And I think it would be very interesting to share some of the findings and some of the lessons learned from this process. Please, Claire.
Thank you very much, Ivan. So I'm representing What's Up Today, Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor. And we're supporting utilities and municipalities extending sanitation services in multiple locations across sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Could you move to the next slide, please, Ivan? Thank you. And so we're working with organizations who are all at really different stages. Some are still establishing their legal basis for providing services, and some are really leading the sector in terms of innovation. And we've seen that the CWIS framework is a really powerful concept. So it's made investment into and promotion of non-sewered solutions much more politically palatable, and it also embeds the understanding that high-quality fecal sewage management can provide safe sanitation and even be prestigious. Next slide, please. But we're not here to talk about how awesome it is, but about some of the challenges in practice. So I want to talk specifically about water and sanitation utilities leading CWIS programs. Partly because in WASUP, we see this as a really positive institutional structure, but also with some quite specific challenges. And those challenges we've seen seem to fall into 2 main camps. So firstly, the really different way utilities need to work to manage networked and non-networked services. And secondly, utilities having to balance the conflicting aims for universal access and commercial viability. Next slide, please. So these pictures are a bit facetious, and it seems like a really obvious point, but taking on a non-network service like fecal sewage management requires a really different skill set, like a much reduced level of control. You need different technical and logistical skills, and it's a really long-term process of institutional change. And in many locations, we've seen utilities also taking on the role of a regulator. So rather than directly providing or contracting services, they are regulating multiple formal and informal private service providers in order to reach citywide coverage. So again, this is a really different and a new skill set. You're often providing training, equipment, monitoring, and enforcement, all of which is in theory could be fairly straightforward, but then there's the building relationships, there's building trust with the private sector and with the wider public, and trying to build expectations and social norms around what safe sanitation should look like. So it's a really complex new role, and it needs resourcing, and particularly through that transition period. But as with all soft interventions, it's really hard to get financing for it, and it's difficult sometimes even to estimate the resourcing needed. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the second point, around utilities having to balance the conflicting aims for universal access and commercial viability. So in theory, under CWIS, the delivery mechanisms are as agnostic as a choice of technology. However, we've often seen that there's often this assumption that market mechanisms can work, that user fees can cover costs, that low-cost sanitation services can be developed which are appropriate for low-income areas, and can be delivered by the private sector with really light touch monitoring by the utility. But what we've seen is that approach doesn't really square with the aim and often the explicit mandate to provide universal access, or with a human right to sanitation. So we're repeatedly learning that providing safe sanitation, so safe for the households, safe for workers, safe for society at large, has a high cost, even more so in lower income areas, due to difficult access, poor quality containment, and so on. And obviously, safe sanitation has enormous benefits, but that doesn't accrue directly back to whoever's providing or enabling the service. So what we've seen is in the absence of significant public financing, then the utilities who are really serious about universal access are effectively acting as social enterprises or social entrepreneurs. So we've seen utility staff working multiple roles, establishing sanitation units in the evening and the weekends, working with tiny budgets, effectively bootstrapping, getting those services formalized and scaled. So this incredible commitment is really inspiring, and we talk quite a lot within WaSUP about how we need more heroic narratives to reflect the work. But at the same time, these are essential public services with huge externalities, so no one should be bootstrapping that. Next slide, please. So then linking it back to integrity. So in terms of integrity, the mainstream points I hope we can discuss later about direct contracting, public contracting versus enabling the private sector. But for this bit of the presentation, I wanted to focus on the implementing partners. And particularly the implementing partners like WaSUP and others need to reflect on our own integrity in the approaches that we're promoting. So for example, are we overly optimistic about the potential of the private sector? And are we transparent about what financially viable services really mean? So within WaSUP, we mean a sustainable level of subsidy, but we don't necessarily always articulate it in that way. And are we thinking carefully enough about the weight of what utilities are taking on in reaching for universal access to sanitation? And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks for start unpacking a little bit the complexity of the topic and also about the important aspect of profitability versus granting access to sanitation for all. I will now move to the next speaker. Just a second. All right. So the next speaker will be, we're going to be now transitioning into the regulatory ecosystem. And the next speaker is Bill Twyman. He's a water and sanitation specialist at Agua Consult. In 2021, Agua Consult has conducted a research looking at the regulation within Lusaka's urban sanitation sector under the lens of integrity and the reduction of corruption. So Bill will be presenting some of the findings from this report.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ivan. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And yeah, thank you very much, Claire, Christoph, for the presentations so far. I think, fortunately, I think Zambia, Lusaka are quite nice examples of a few of the key points that you made. As Ivan mentioned, I think this presentation will really be trying to give a rapid overview of how urban sanitation services are regulated in Zambia and detail kind of some of the different corruption integrity failures that we found in the urban sanitation subsector there. Next slide, please. So I wanted to begin by kind of showing a couple of figures from a large separate study we did with SOS a couple of years ago. And really this is to help show that Zambia is actually at the forefront of many of these kind of key dimensions of regulating water supply sanitation, including the regulation of urban sanitation services as well. So the figure on the left-hand side is kind of looking at the predominant regulatory form applied in countries across Africa. I think you'll see that Zambia is one of several countries in dark blue there kind of highlighting the fact it's got a dedicated regulatory agency. This was established in 2000, and it was really one of the first countries across sub-Saharan Africa to do this. And we're now seeing this much kind of wider, broader trend towards regulation by agency, with I know countries like Zimbabwe, Malawi, DRC, Ethiopia, Nigeria, all also moving in this direction as well. The figure on the right-hand side looks at the extent to which these different regulatory actors across Africa are applying a range of different regulatory mechanisms, kind of ranging from standards to monitoring and reporting to regulation by incentives, and also applying sanctions. I think you can see here, Zambia is one of the few countries in kind of dark green there, really highlighting that it's made quite a lot of progress here alongside several other Eastern Southern African countries as well. Next slide, please. What we did normally see, though, in that large study kind of looking across Africa was that we had a real kind of water supply bias in the regulation of water supply and sanitation services. I think that's something that Ivan mentioned at the beginning. That's not something which Zambia has managed to completely avoid, but it is important to note that Zambia is one of the countries really at the forefront of the regulation of urban sanitation services, in particular urban on-site sanitation services as well. So I won't bore you too much by kind of running through all the roles and responsibilities on the screen in front of you here. This is kind of a summary of those main roles and responsibilities as it relates to regulating urban sanitation services. One key point is you've got this kind of surrogate regulator for part of this responsibility, as Claire kind of mentioned, with the Lusaka Water and Sanitation Company taking on some key regulatory functions as a bridge between smaller service providers and the overall regulator, the National Water Supply and Sanitation Council. The key point to note here is that Zambia is one of a small set of countries on the continent that has made really impressive progress in regulating urban sanitation services, and in particular urban on-site sanitation services. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, I think despite the progress that we see in Zambia in the regulation of urban sanitation services, in this study back in 2020, 2021, we still found quite a wide-ranging set of kind of corruption and integrity failures occurring in the capital city, Lusaka. And these kind of spanned kind of three major categories, which also equate to common areas you might see these challenges for water supply as well. In the first instance, this included corruption in public financial management, which spanned issues in procurement, bribery of public officials by the private sector, nepotism or bribery in the award of employment, also kind of per diem, smaller scale accounting fraud on a very common basis as well. Secondly, we also saw corruption at the citizen to institution interface, which covered bribery to reduce regular fees, bribery to obtain a service, such as a sewer connection, for example, also bribery to accelerate administrative procedures, such as the speed at which improved services could be provided, or an improved service could be provided. We also saw a few examples of kind of wider integrity failures. Lots of these to do with kind of political influence were quite hard to pin down, but one which was very clear was the kind of mishandling of a sanitation surcharge by the Lusaka Water and Sanitation Company. So this is a kind of 2.5% levy that Zambia's utilities can apply to customers' water supply tariffs to fund sanitation improvements if they achieve certain performance benchmarks. And this right was kind of taken away from the utility because of the use of funds for kind of improper investments, mainly in fact for investing in water supply services over sanitation services. Of these kind of wide-ranging set of interventions of corruption integrity failures, on the screen, we see that corruption in procurement was particularly concerning. I think this reflects, I think, the point Claire was making around how international organizations behave, looking internally at their own kind of integrity responsibilities. But we really did see a wide-ranging sets of kind of corruption in procurement. As I say, this was particularly concerning, with several instances where powerful actors were accused of engaging in corrupt acts by multiple reliable stakeholders. Most troubling were issues highlighted in the procurement of really particularly large international organizations programs, as these concern sizable contracts and have a clear substantial negative impact on service provision. Next slide, please. What we see in terms of the impact is that corruption integrity failures are part of what's often termed kind of a shadow system. This makes measuring the impact of these integrity failures difficult to quantify. It's not something which is always in the public domain, but we do see that global estimates have found that corruption integrity failures cost us anywhere between 10 and 45% of sector finances. For Lusaka, we were certainly a long way away from being able to put our finger down on a figure such as that, but there were several explicit impacts that were detailed that came out of the study as well. In the first instance, we saw delayed program implementation and a reduction in the scope of sanitation improvements of about 20% for some programs. We also saw reduced service provider financial viability because of integrity failures in procurement processes, as well as the range of forms of corruption at the citizen to institution interface, including bribery to reduce regular fees, bribery to obtain a service as well. Finally, we also saw that the mishandling of a sanitation surcharge prevented the Lusaka Water and Sanitation Company from accessing the surcharge. And then during the period 2016 to 2019, that equated to US $1.8 million, which could have been used for funding sanitation improvements in the city, which it wasn't able to access. Across all of this, I think as the quote below kind of tries to demonstrate, we see that it's low-income households, it's people in the most vulnerable kind of sectors of society that were the most impacted by these corruption integrity failures. Often these were the ones which were actually targeted in some cases. Even when they're not targeted, they're affected very much indirectly by services not being expanded, services not being improved to those areas. Next slide, please. In terms of key takeaways and implications, there's really kind of three which I'd like to quickly flag. The first is that I think as a sector as a whole, we've got very good at analyzing and understanding the visible system. What we need to increasingly do is to kind of recognize that shadow systems exist, even in contexts where this visible system is performing well. As I tried to show at the beginning of the presentation, Zambia really is a country which is at the forefront of water supply sanitation regulation on the continent. It's got a huge number of best practices that many countries can learn from. Nevertheless, it's still got many corruption and integrity failures occurring in the urban sanitation sector. No doubt in many of the countries which don't have dedicated regulatory actors, which haven't made the progress applying these different regulatory mechanisms, no doubt these issues will be much more perverse, much more widespread in their sectors. We also need to increase our understanding of these shadow systems. I think we need to increasingly be asking ourselves, increasingly be investigating what are the types of corruption and integrity failures that occur, what are the weaknesses and gaps that can enable them to occur, and what are the best practices that can help to prevent them as well. And then finally, we need to work to address identified weaknesses. I think coming out of our work in Zambia and Lusaka, there were a range of kind of improvements which were recommended, including in relation to the e-procurement system, per diem management, strengthening certain specific aspects of the regulatory environment, also improving data collection and public reporting specifically on issues of integrity failures or issues that enable integrity failures to occur. And that's everything from my side. Back to you, Ivan.
Thank you very much, Bill, for showing us what are some of the manifestations of integrity failures in CWIS, in sanitation, but also talking about the impacts, and both, you mentioned economic, but also societal impacts. So we're gonna get back to this definitely afterwards during the Q&A. But now we are moving from Africa. We're going to Asia with the last two speakers for today. So we first go to a country where they don't have a centralized regulatory body. This is Bangladesh. We have invited Tanveer Ahmed, the Center Director at ITM Buet, to share with us some of the developments in the uptake of CWIS in Bangladesh. And also he will be presenting a couple of examples illustrating the CWIS 7 principles. So, Tanveer, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Yes, just a minute. Okay, just a second. Okay, got it.
Perfect, we can see you. If you
Can see the slides. Yes, so I'll just go into the slide sharing. Sorry, I think, yeah. Okay, sorry about the disruption. You can see my slides, right?
Yes,
So,
yes, yes.
so I'm going to talk about the Bangladesh perspective on citywide inclusive sanitation. So basically, I'll start the discussion with the situation in Dhaka city, which is which is the mega city, and then what is happening in the municipalities, how the country is moving towards adopting the CWIS principles, and what sort of ecosystem we have currently, which can be, the regulation can be envisaged. What sort of regulation can be envisaged? So the situation in Dhaka, as you see, it's the sanitation system is kind of all over the place. We have a very low coverage of the sewerage system, and that sewerage system hasn't expanded through over time, and therefore only due to lack of maintenance, only 1.2% of the households are basically connected to the sewer, and it ends up being treated. It's only one sewerage treatment plant for a city of 20 million. And although the city has expanded northwards, the sewerage system hasn't expanded. FSM was never in the in any of the plans, and this serves as an ideal example where sewerage system couldn't be expanded, and therefore you have a very low coverage. The individual components of the FSM service chain also are very poor, both in the sanitation, in the containment systems. The collection system is sometimes unsafe. The transportation system is also through open drains and sewers and almost non-existent treatment. You end up disposing it in the lowland or canals, rivers, and eventually everything's getting polluted. And the sheet flow diagram just reflects this. Only 2% is safely managed, although the numbers might be even lower. In this backdrop, when the concept of CWIS is evolving, the country has developed what is called the Institutional and Regulatory Framework for FSM, which basically outlines all the key stakeholders involved and what their relationship is in this FSM service chain. We have the ministries, the development partners, the city corporations, the local government institutions, NGOs, other research institutions, and the utilities. What is their interlinkage in terms of service provision and how the FSM service can be delivered to the citizens? And this document basically serves as the backdrop on how, the FSM service chain can be implemented with a city as well as the whole Bangladesh. Now, if we look at the CWIS principles, it's also already Christoph has discussed some of these, that it has to be, everyone benefits, there has to be equity, has to be safely managed. There are clear inclusive mandates. It has to be a combination of different solutions, pro-poor financing, above all political will. It's all built in the CWIS principles. But we see some of these implementations in the small cities or municipalities, as we call, and there has been examples set up by the NGOs that, where you can see examples of equity or has been, implemented, and you have Faridpur city where you have a situation where you have toilets for catering to everybody. In Faridpur city, you have some examples on gender and social equity. There are cooperatives, women-led FSTP operations, toilets having MHM facilities. These are all good examples of gender and social equity. Sakipur city, you see examples of safely managed along the entire service chain. It is probably one of the cities which basically closes the loop on the sanitation service chain. Good OHS practices for sanitation workers, co-composting the treated effluent, etc. Khulna City Corporation is an example where you have KPIs has been set, there are clear inclusive mandates and some performance targets they're working on using the IMIS, and it serves as a good example of how authorities can operate with all these things, and they have some sort of accountability, etc. So you see some examples of these CWIS principles occurring, but in order to have this all working together, you need actually a collaborative ecosystem, and you need diverse partners working in different aspects. And that's how you can bring this whole FSM value chain or the whole thing into action. So in line with the institutional and regulatory framework in Bangladesh, we have basically developed a CWIS ecosystem where you have the ministry on top and the local government institutions and the agencies to support the sanitation investments. You have financing institutions. You have the GWS CTA hub set up by the BMGF. The Municipal Association of Bangladesh, which are a leader of all municipalities in Bangladesh. You have FSM network and civil society partners. You have the INGOs who are working in this, and also us, IT and BUIT as a capacity building hub. So all together, we are actually working, and we have developed this ecosystem, which is now, I mean, if the investments are now being channelized through DPHE and other organizations, so that we have now CWIS projects being developed in Bangladesh. But still, it's a very long way to go. We have 329 municipalities. We have FSTPs only in a few numbers. But CWIS projects is being developed, supported by Islamic Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, AIIB, and other partners. And probably we'll have around 107 FSTPs or in 107 municipalities by the end of maybe 2025 or something. But still, it's a very long way to go. We need to cover a huge spatial context. So 216 municipalities all over Bangladesh are left unserved, and that coverage has to be made. So it's not only the geographic context. The challenges remain because we're still adopting traditional approaches in the planning or in the implementation. We have to move into this CWIS or this inclusive sanitation service mode, where we have to, although we have some examples, but that has to be replicated and scaled up. And all these aspects has to be considered. Equitable sanitation has to be covered over the entire value chain. Resource recovery has to be built in the system. Mix of technologies, has to be innovation, proper financing, strong political will, and the accountability, responsibility, those things has to be built in. And the new CWIS projects will have all these components in, but I think now in the sanitation ecosystem, it needs to be actually properly regulated. And the avenues are there, and the government is now thinking about establishing a regulatory mechanism on sanitation and also water, and thinking of how this can be done. So a lot of brainstorming has now started, and we are actually actively involved, IT and BUIT, of course, in helping the government to develop any sort of regulatory mechanism. So I'll end it here. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Tanvir. It was short, but it's very comprehensive. So thanks. I think we got quite a good understanding of the current conversations and next steps in Bangladesh. Before we move to the last speaker, just a reminder, I see a couple of questions there, but keep them going, because after the next presenter, we're going to be opening up to the questions from the public, and we're going to start with yours. So if anything has piqued your interest or you want to know more, drop us a message in the chat. So we cross the border and we go to India now. We have also the pleasure to have with us Rohini Pradeep. She's the project manager at the Consortium for DWAT's Dissemination Society in India. And she's also a member of Susanna's Global Steering Committee. So Rohini will be presenting the challenges and the way forward for CWIS implementation in some of the Indian towns where she has worked in. And it's interesting because there's going to be a focus on non-sewered sanitation. So Rohini, please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible and my screen is visible.
It is.
Okay, thank you. Before I start, as even introduced me, so I am from a CDD India. It's an NGO based in Bangalore, mostly working on decentralized sanitation services along with CWIS as a main principle. To start my presentation, I also use Christoph's and my previous presenters who have actually presented about CWIS. I think it's the same approach what everybody presented here. So it is for us, it's more of a public service approach, which mainly strengthens the different levels of public services in terms of the national level or it in the city level or in the state level for us. So it will strengthen the much more by bringing in the responsibility, accountability, and also a better resource planning so that it can ensure an advanced level in terms of the equitable, safe, and sustainable manner. So when I start looking at each principles of CYS, I'm pretty sure each one of us have already started. Then from projects that we have been working in different cities and different towns, so this is what we have been mainly, saying that when you talk about equity, it is from a service level, it is more on, presenting a quality pricing, subsidies, and fairness in terms of the distribution of resources. Safety, which is environment and public health, specifically a safety of our customers, workers, and community, so that they away from the health risk. Sustainability, this is bringing in different varieties of services so that it is more reliable and continuity. Responsibility, bringing a responsibility across the board with everyone, starting from a public to the higher officials. Accountability by bringing a lot of performance monitoring, data transparency, and little incentives so that they do this monitoring very easy way, and resource planning and management, which is basically an effective management and utilization of the resources that is there. So let me move to the next part. So when we talk about integrity, so from a CYS angle, I see integrity will definitely strengthen our planning activity. Integrity will actually support us in a different context of the city by bringing in many factor. Like example I see is a trust building, so the trust building between every stakeholders in this city level or city services will brings the integrity into it. Equitable access, very much on transparent process, utilizing the funds optimally, accounting mechanism, bringing capacity building, regulatory framework, and much and more, which is not least, I would say, the community engagement. So CYS also talks about bringing in a lot of community engagement where you get to understand their preferences so that you can provide a better services. I want to give one of the examples that we typically see in most of the Indian city that we have been working with. Example, these are the pictures from the community toilets that we have worked in few cities, major city. The major issues that we always bring in here is that, so you have a community toilet, either it is not maintained or even if it is maintained, the usage has been very low. They have a major issue has been getting a funds for managing this, or they don't have water facility. Even you have toilets, but there is no water supply into it. Challenges in monitoring and maintenance issue. These are something that community toilets that they face. So why I brought this particular examples in terms of CYS is that because what happens, because we have some area, generally we end up building some community toilets or a public toilet, but actually speaking the requirement may be in a different places, or the places there is a requirement but the maintenance issue has been there. This is a common thing that we see, is that where the planning is gone little wrong in placing or identifying the proper location or a proper place for city sanitation planning side. Coming to the next, so as a overall, this is one I talked about in terms of the placing and the planning issues. When it comes to planning activity that we see majorly is that there are a mix of service providers and their responsibility. So what happens in any city, given an example that the previous presenter did about, let's say, desludging operations. So you also have a government vehicle, you also have a private service provider. Here is where the clashes comes, where they don't have proper responsibility. Maybe they need a better engagement plan so that they don't become a competitor to each other instead of serving the community in a better. Second, lack of clarity, lack of capacity in terms of the local and municipality levels. This is I think, a common problem across every board, starting from a small village level to community level to then to the next commissioner level everywhere. So what you see is that they may want to do a lot of work, but the human resource availability may be very low, or they may, even if they are there, they are not capable or able to do what's supposed to be is being assigned for. Then sharing of the resources in small towns. This is an example I wanted to give, the picture that I show. So this is from one of the town that we are working in Karnataka, South India. What happens is that the desludging vehicle is mounted on a tractor. Morning, the tractor goes and then cleans the solid waste, means they collect the solid waste and let it into their landfill site. Afternoon, they use this vehicle, a tractor, to mount a desludging trucks and then go around and do the desludging. Hence, the same resource has been shared for two activity. In this, there is no wrong, but the problem is that because of that, the service delivery get delayed, and they end up going for other options, or maybe they want to just like a household don't want to wait for 2 days if it is already blocked. Then they go for either a private agency, or they just ended up connecting, using manually cleaning or just connecting to the nearby drain. These kind of services that we see. Lastly, it is on the finances. Everywhere it's the same issues. Operation maintenance, lot of our policies and guidelines that are coming in majorly focus on putting up the capital cost or the infrastructure. But when it comes to operation maintenance, this is where we see there is a lack in availability. So the municipality finally, or a town level municipality, will end up paying these O&M from their municipal funds, which is not coming from either a central funds or from a state funds. So for a municipality, they will have their many responsibility to manage. For them, sanitations become always a last priority. Hence, they may not get a money to do operation maintenance, this infrastructure that is specifically built for sanitation. When you talk about inclusivity and then affordability, I see this can be strengthened, or the issues that I've talked about can be overcome by bringing in proper planning. That means integrating planning. So when I talk about integrated planning, it is also about the sectors I'm talking. So there is a water supply, there is a sanitation, there is a solid waste, there is also on the urban planning. So if we can bring in all these departments together or sectors together and plan it, which will have a much more accessibility and a better service can be provided. Looking at a decentralized way of managing, so not just go for always a centralized approach, go for based on the city condition, the area availability or the resource availability, they can go for a decentralized approach. PPP model, this is one I see in India which is moving very fast, bringing in private people into the service provision, where they will design, implement, and also monitor, and then ensure that the service is delivered, because their payment has been linked with a service delivery. So then there is a much more, I would say, very good services that been provided to the community. Subsidy program, this is something will definitely drive. There are some tests, or I would say pilots have been taken, example from a rainwater harvesting thing. So if you have a rainwater harvesting, people typically, there is a subsidy that they get an excuses for some water bill. So the subsidy programs need to be bringing so that more people get educated and more people motivated to take up many services that is required. Community engagement. This is, as I said, one of the important thing, inclusive design. So when I talk about community behavioral change, definitely including all the stakeholders, all the stakeholders into the planning will definitely will give us a better integrity of the stakeholders and the planning to be more successful. Lastly, what I wanted to say is that everything is there, but once the planning is done, the responsibility of each party involved need to be properly defined and given a resource that they required. either starting from government agency to sanitation providers to community to regulatory bodies. So if they've been given with a proper activities and a responsibility, they'll be able to definitely move this forward and provide a sanitation services to whole city or a town level. And then definitely there are a lot of private people who will be want to do a lot of innovation and research, which will also need to be somehow bringing in the whole cycle of CYS so that they can bring a new idea, new solutions which can be more affordable to the city at the level to manage the whole sanitation services. These are our, I would say, learning from our projects. This is about my presentation. Thank you for providing the time.
Thank you very, very much, Rohini. We've now come to the conclusion of the presentations, and we have 40 minutes for the conversation, questions, and discussions between the online participants and the panelists. I see a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm going to start by addressing these. To Christoph, there's two questions that I'd like to bundle. The first one was whether CWIS also includes solid waste management, and the other question was about the political economy. How does this affect CWIS planning and policies, and what's the future like for CWIS in low and medium income countries?
Okay, thanks. Let me start with the last question. So yes, political will is, of course, central. We've heard that in several of the presentations that were made today, and therefore creating an enabling environment and landscape that is beneficial for implementing CWIS is absolutely important. I think Rohini also pointed that out in her last two slides. And accountability, of course, plays a major role there. What we're seeing, and that I think that's interesting to see, especially around the principle of mixed technologies and mixed systems, we're getting a lot of pushback. And that has to do a lot with the very old school engineering thinking. So one size fits all. We'd like to have sewers for our cities. And what I've heard also from World Bank implementation, for example, in Ethiopia or in Nigeria, is that a lot of the utility managers want to see sewers. So they're not really interested in other solutions than sewered solutions. And I think that's also has created a number of delays also in project implementation. Then maybe the question about solid waste. Yes, I think one of the principles is also to try to take a more integrated and holistic view of providing services. So not only looking at sanitation as a siloed, compartmentalized service provision, but definitely how does solid waste, how does water provision come into the equation? And of course, that is difficult to do. It makes it more complex also in the planning, but I think it's absolutely necessary to also include other subsectors like solid waste management. Over.
Thank you, Christoph. I'm gonna now move to Bill, because there's also some interest in what you were presenting. Two questions here. We would like to know, to go a little bit deeper into this discovery of the misuse of the sanitation surcharge, whether customers were made aware of the misuse, and if you know there was any initiative to bring awareness to customers on tracking the delivery of service. And then there's another question about the phenomenon of corruption in the water sector. Why is it so widespread, and what could be some of the reasons? This could be a separate eternity talk, so it's very broad. But if you have some ideas, and maybe also I'll ask some of our colleagues to maybe post in the chat some of our publications that could talk in this regard.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Ivan. So firstly, on the sanitation surcharge, I think it's important to say it was contested by the utility, Lusaka Water and Sanitation Company. It also wasn't because of kind of a misappropriation of these funds, or necessarily because they were being pulled out by utility managers or anything like that. It was due to the fact they were used, I think, for water supply improvements instead of sanitation improvements. So depending on how you categorize the extent of mishandling. because this was contested, I think it was made quite publicly aware. Well, it certainly came out in things like newspapers. I think NOASCO, a regulator, posted about it on social media. NOASCO is also one of kind of several regulators we see across sub-Saharan Africa as well, who produce really detailed, really useful kind of annual sector performance reports as well. Lots of that is kind of traffic light information, kind of level of service, operational efficiency, these sort of elements. Also kind of more qualitative information on the performance of each of the different utilities as well. And I'm sure points in there on the kind of the handling of the sanitation surcharge, what that was used for, what it was supposed to have been used for, certainly would have made its way into those reports as well. On the second, on the much bigger question, Ivan, I won't try and answer that in its totality on the kind of reasons for corruption in the water sector, but maybe I'd look at it from two angles. I think firstly, people in the sector often, I think, use the excuse of the water sector, the sanitation sectors being quite asset heavy sectors, which create lots of opportunities for corruption, more so than in other sectors. I think I would prefer to look at it in terms of weaknesses in the sector and us getting our house in order as well. In terms of the regulatory models we're applying, I think we've seen lots of progress in terms of this switch to establishing dedicated regulatory actors, dedicated regulatory agencies in many cases, but in far too many countries, regulatory responsibilities are still hidden within ministries who don't pay much attention to them. I think also we see many weaknesses in the regulatory environment, whether or not it's in relation to autonomy, capacity, coordination, accountability. And then finally, I think there's weaknesses in the application of both broad integrity mechanisms, whether or not it's standards, monitoring, reporting, incentives, sanctions, but also much more specific integrity mechanisms as well, be that in relation to governance, human resources, project execution. On top of all of that, I think what we're doing well, we're mainly doing well for urban water supply services and the largest service providers. For urban sanitation, for rural water, for many of the smaller service providers, we're even further behind as well. So I think there's a huge amount that we can do as a sector to strengthen our regulation, put that regulatory environment in place in order to limit those opportunities. I think we see corruption in pretty much all cases, but there's a lot more that we could be doing to reduce those opportunities, to reduce the scale of it.
Thanks. That's a very good answer. Thanks. I'm gonna now turn to Claire. I think there's still, you've touched already upon the consideration for balancing this universal access and commercial to sanitation with the commercial viability. There's Betty who would like to learn a little bit more. And if you have maybe also some examples from the countries you've visited in utilities successfully doing it.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much for the question. So I guess I probably should have led with the fact that we, the aim of WASP is to extend sanitation and water services into low-income areas. So the majority of our work on sanitation has been either working with utilities and municipalities to incentivize extension of services into those areas or direct provision within those areas. So I guess examples, so maybe going back to the Lusaka example. So WASP worked establishing pit emptying services in Kanyama and Tizanga. I can put some links into the chat of the work that was done there, which brought us back really because we were hoping, and we always kind of were leading with this idea that we'd be able to bring down the cost of services so that we would be able to get an appropriate service for a low-income area. And the fact is that we have been able to do that, but not to the point where you'd be able to reach universal access. So it's that challenge really. And then again, within extending services from high and low income areas. So SWEEP, which is the example in Bangladesh, which again, I'll put some links into the chat. That's a contracting model where there's a percentage within each contract between the private sector provider and municipality. There's a percentage of low income consumers who have to be met as part of a contract condition. But again, it's very challenging to get that as part of a profitable model. So then how do you balance those two? You know, providing sanitation services in high income and middle income areas is fairly straightforward. It's really moving out and having that universal access, which is the issue. But let me put some examples in the chat, if that's okay.
Yes, thanks. There's one point in the Q&A which I think we haven't addressed yet. I think this is maybe for Christoph again. It's a little bit how do we see CWIS as opposed to rural sanitation, right? since it's it's also in the name, city-based approach by name. So yeah, I'll tell us a little bit more about the if it's the expanded, is this included, or is it in addition to it? Christoph, are you hearing us?
So about rural sanitation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm the wrong person to ask here, because
Okay.
I really don't do anything in rural sanitation. But
Right.
I would also probably say, rural sanitation, although the numbers are much lower, I think the complexities are also far lower than in urban areas. I think the complexity of urban sanitation are far higher, and we've seen it from the presentations today. The number of actors that need to be involved, the complexities of the technologies, the financing. So I would say probably not the right tool to adopt for rural areas, because it deals with a different set of issues and problems.
Thank you. Rohini, what do you think? You've worked in rural areas as well.
Yeah. So I agree with what Christoph talked about it. The problem, the volume of the problem or the complexity will be very minimal in the rural, but the principles of CWIS will definitely apply to rural also, because there also you have people who are like with the different stakeholders and all. Principle is applicable, I would say, but I don't see that you can go in that level of planning in rural, because it's a small settlement that we'll be talking. So that's what I see, because some projects that we worked in rural, definitely we integrated all the people who are part of this whole sanitation provision. I see there is that requirement is there, but probably not immediately. Maybe in the future, definitely you will have the same problems in rural also. So it's better now start thinking in this direction. Maybe maybe make it little simple to the rural context, I would say.
All right. Okay. Simplifying it and adjusting it makes sense. Tanvir, I have a question for you. So ITM Poet provides capacity building, and you have now this focus on CWIS. So I want to understand, what have you observed, in terms of CWIS aspects that most need to be trained. We're talking about functions, we're talking about different approaches. So where do you see the need for more trainings generally? And then we wanted also to know about capacity building on participation, accountability, integrity, whether you think this could be, how this could strengthen some of the elements of CWIS.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have been working on capacity building for quite a long time, recently more so on the CWIS. What I see from the municipalities and the project implementers is that there is a good appetite for these sanitation systems. I mean, all over. People do understand. Maybe the awareness level might not be that high at the household level, but this CWIS has to be achieved with everybody, all the stakeholders. You need awareness for starting from the household level. You need awareness for the local government institutions. You need for the implementers and also high up in the ministries. So far in Bangladesh, the capacity building efforts have been, I would say, limited to project implementers, maybe ministry officials. But this is now widely recognized that you have to, although the implementers, they do the infrastructure, but eventually they hand it over to the local government institutions. So the mayors and the city officials, they have become important stakeholders, and this is now realized very well. And so in our future capacity building efforts, the government and the development partners, they have essentially now prioritized capacity building at the local level government institutions. And regarding the topics or subjects, we are covering a whole range of CWIS principles, outcomes, all these, but we do have to make them realize that citywide inclusive sanitation is just a change of mindset. You're going to do the same thing that you're doing right now, but now with a different mindset. that you have to look at equity, you have to look at sustainability and things, develop business models. And so it's the same sanitation. You'll be doing vacuum operation, FSTP running and things like that. But keeping in mind that you have to think about the sustainability and long-term viability of these solutions. So that's those things we have to put in their minds. And this is not only for sanitation, it's true for also water supply, other aspects where there's a service provision involved. And basically changing the mindset that sanitation is not only infrastructure, it's also sanitation also means service. And people usually they were not, I mean, accustomed to think like that. They thought that sanitation is just like, you know, a toilet or but it's a combination of everything. So that change of mindset, I think, is gradually happening, and we are actually focusing on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanvir. And linked to the last bit that you just mentioned, it's a little bit a question for everyone, and there was also one in the chat around that. So CWIS, as you all were presenting today, it was it seems it's strongly based on principles, right? That what should be happening, that should be proper, should be inclusive. So does let's say the new mindset of CWIS also come together with novelty in terms of changing the ecosystems or new forms of planning or new ways of financing? Or what about the regulation, prioritization of non-sewered sanitation? So if any of you would like to expand off beside the principle, if there's, let's say, a larger framework of action implied within CWIS.
So I'm certainly not one of the many CWIS experts in the room, but I think one of the things which is really nice about CWIS is, because of its focus on principles, is its flexibility that it gives to country context and to the environment in which it's being kind of implemented within. So I don't think, from what I've seen anyway, you've kind of got any one approach within that which has to be pushed forward. I think the focus on principles enables you to take it in different directions based on that kind of country context or city context as well. So one of my pet projects, one of the things I really love, is always pushing for is regulation by agency. I think in most cases, that's the most appropriate regulatory model. Generally speaking, you see better regulator performance where you've got this dedicated regulatory agency. But that's not the case in every context as well. So I think certainly there's some things like the push towards regulation by agency as one example, which you really are seeing across sub-Saharan Africa at quite a considerable pace now, with organizations like SOS being expanded, with countries like Malawi, Zimbabwe, I think Ethiopia, all slowly moving towards regulation by agency, looking to establish this regulatory model. At the same time, there's some countries with ministerial regulation which are doing a relatively quite good job and might not take that step in the next 5 to 10 years, and that can be okay.
All right, thanks, Bill. I don't know if anyone wants to add to this.
So from like Indian experience, recently the Ministry of Urban Housing and then Systems, so they came up with a mixed solution as a major way forward for a cities. Which started like how they started this whole regulatory the solution that they gave is, okay, the mixed in the city, which is a core part of it, will go for a centralized systems, which maybe let's say 30 to 40% of the city will go with. When it comes to the outer side of this core city, so either you go for a decentralized systems, which are for institutions or an apartment or a residential layout. For a remaining, what they told is that why don't you use IND, so what we call it as an interception and diversion system, to tap the wastewater from the open channel, bring it into STP to the outside the city. So already the regulatory bodies, I see that they understand it's a complex problem. We can't have a single solution to manage the sanitation throughout the city. So they are bringing up this kind of a solution as a part of their policy itself. So they allotted a budget accordingly, like for a centralized system, for a sewer system, this is a budget. For like a per capita, they have allotted a budget so that even the cities can actually go and then select a solution. this is one, I would say, that which pushed a lot of cities, small towns in India to go for a different solution other than centralized systems. I see regulatory bodies play a very much, very high role in bringing these such kind of changes in the planning.
Thanks, Rohini.
Yeah.
And maybe if, oh, sorry, no, after you.
Oh, sorry, I think I'll talk after you.
Okay, thank you. I was just going to add on to Rohini's point that she also put into the chat in terms of changed mindsets. And certainly what we've seen is, I mean, the innovation is not so much around the tech. I think people have been working on trying to promote on-site sanitation for a long time, but a lot around the just the level of proactiveness and people working together with utilities to say, okay, we have this new mandate, and particularly where the mandates are for complete access to sanitation, and then working together to develop solutions. And so we've seen utilities that previously, let me think. So, for example, in Kenya, all the utilities were water and sewerage, and now they're rebranding themselves to be water and sanitation and saying, like, no, we know sewage is not going to be possible for us, so we are going to be investing in on-site sanitation. And that explicit focus on that mixed level, I do think there has been quite a significant shift from the funders, from the World Bank. They have a huge number now of investments into on-site sanitation, and utilities recognizing that this has to be, it's not just a transitory phase; it has to be a long-term investment. Certainly, we've seen that change in WhatsApp.
All right, Tampir?
Yeah. In Bangladesh, you also see the change in mindset. Our major utility is now thinking about providing on-site sanitation solutions, and they never thought about these things. But regarding regulatory mechanism, it's a different ball game, I think. We see good examples in Africa, as was shown in the presentation. That of course, regulation by agency is kind of the predominant or probably the most successful one. Maybe it works better if you have a lot of utilities and a lot of private operators, and regulating them is easier. I think, I mean, it's my personal opinion. But if you have like government agencies providing service, if you have government or semi-government agencies acting as utilities, and then I think having independent regulatory mechanisms, people are very averse to, as we have seen the mindset in Bangladesh, having an independent regulatory agency, that effort actually has failed. So, but this CWIS concept here, which comes through with the notion of, accountability, responsibility, all these things, have now given a new dimension towards moving towards some sort of regulation or having these activities regulated. Because in order to implement CWIS, regulation is already inbuilt somewhat in the system. There is some sort of, because we have some sort of feedback, accountability, and these things. So those indicators are already inbuilt in some of the cities if you want to implement CWIS. And that is a regulatory mechanism by itself to some extent. And maybe we can kind of leverage those aspects and those KPIs and things like that and build our regulatory mechanism around it. It could be a regulation by agency, could be a regulation by contract by the local government institutions, or could be some other forms of regulation. But the idea is to bring everything under the regulatory mechanism blanket. And it could be a combination of things as we've seen in Africa. And we have to work our way towards that. So that's I'm talking from the point of view of the context of Bangladesh. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tampir. Bill, would you have any early thinking, recommendation, or consideration for a country like Bangladesh who are considering, the different forms of regulation when it comes to CWIS?
I don't think so. I mean, I'd have to be honest, this is a country we're just starting to look at urban sanitation regulation in as part of this kind of wider study with WIN. I think before seeing that results, I'd be making a lot of guesses. I'd probably say something quite foolish. I think I would just emphasize Tanvir's point though as well. I think you've got a system in Bangladesh where you've got government performing this huge role, both from a policy perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from a service delivery perspective. And it's a little bit like being the judge, jury, and executioner at the same time, which I think whichever regulatory model you pick is going to create lots of kind of inbuilt challenges, lots of perverse incentives, lots of disincentives from kind of more abrupt, more forceful regulation. So I think whichever regulatory model you go down in such a system is going to have lots of drawbacks, lots of challenges to implementing it effectively.
Thanks, Bill. So we'll keep the suspense until March, April, when the comparative study is going to be published by WIN, and we can update you later on that. I hope I'm not missing any questions in the chat, but while I'm looking to the ones that I might not have covered yet, I wanted to do a little detour and talk about participation, right? Because that's also one of the components of CWIS that I'd like to expand a little bit more. In particular, one of the objectives of CWIS is also about gender equality and women empowerment in the planning, designing, and management of the sanitation systems. And we all know that's not easy. So I wanted to maybe look at the experiences in India with Rohini, and maybe Claire also, you might have some examples of lessons learned about inclusion, empowerment of women along the CWIS chain.
Yeah, I think that's another major focus has been in India. So a lot of the sanitation services has been handed over to a woman-led group or a completely a women group. So state of Orissa, which is a coastal state, where most of the FSTPs, STPs are managed by the women group. So they also been trained on how to operate it and then manage it. Like they collect the user fee, even the desludging vehicle also, drawn by some of the ladies who has been trained well. They do the desludging activity, they take care of the FSTP, they take care of the reused products and then whole operations. So there is a very specific focus that has been provided, empowering some of the women. It's with the FSTP. I'm also talking about the even the public toilets and community toilets. So those are also being specifically, like when they call for a tender from a government, they specifically ask for if there are any women-led SHG groups are available. Then that has been given as a priority so that they can take over, and with them they also manages as well as they also become more sustainable in terms for longer run. So there are many such cases that you can see across many states in India who is actually giving more focus on women-led programs in sanitation services.
And do you think, Rohini, is this part of the CWIS movement, or has this happened regardless? Or I mean, you know what I mean,
Yeah, got it. I think I would say in India there are very specific states who have really moved in CWIS angle. Like there are few states, but otherwise, as a sanitation sector as such, there is a lot of such preferences are coming. I can't directly link it to CWIS, but there are states who are actually working on CWIS concept. They are doing it. But there are also states who are not even thought about CWIS but doing this work. I will not say it is just because of CWIS. It could be also the awareness that has bring in community and the policy makers that is also helping a lot.
All right.
Maybe if I could just add a little bit. So, I mean, I guess like Rohini, this is what isn't always directly linked to CWIS programs, but it's always worked that's linked to extending services in low-income areas. And I think we found, similarly to Rohini, like the importance of developing trust, the importance of local management. And so certainly we're working with utilities, municipalities, we try to look at how they could either have local offices or be working through local CBOs to have those trusted routes of communication in. And the other main area we've learned around in terms of design of services has been the importance of actually demonstrating what a safe sanitation service looks like. So we found, for example, one of the elements of work we normally try to do is to make pit emptying more visible, because then it's more easier to monitor, it's easier to control. But for many people, that idea is absolutely horrific. We've been told you're trying to shame us. How can you be asking us to empty our latrines in the daytime? This is disgusting. And so actually bringing in professional pit emptying teams to demonstrate what the service looks like, so that people can see both see the service, and so the utility can understand how it's viewed by low-income communities, like what do they think is important, what would they like it to look like, has been a really important part of service design in low-income areas. And that same process in terms of thinking about payment and communication, everything else, like how trying to model and prototype things as much as possible so that you can have really meaningful participation has been a big part of our work. It's not so much focused on gender, but focused on working in low-income communities.
Yeah. No, thanks. That's very important to share. Thanks. Claire, I stay with you just for a second. Have you also observed utilities that have to adapt to new regulations for on-site sanitation? How was this, adaptation? Yeah, if there was any good example.
So I'd say, I think, which I might have said earlier, so excuse me if I'm repeating myself, but what we've seen in terms of good examples hasn't been so much adapting, so it hasn't been passively adapting to regulation, it's been engaging with the process, and utilities kind of leaning into those discussions and saying, look, this is working, this isn't working, and having that really active discussion. So I guess particularly Zambia and Kenya, where I know they're leading the field in terms of this work, that's where we've seen probably the most positive process. And also, I think like recognizing it as like a long-term change within a utility. So like not taking it lightly, like thinking about it as this is institutional, long-term institutional change to run citywide services. They have like low demand, you've got low profit margins. And what we see is it's typically really deprioritized so that regulation kind of pushing on-site sanitation just doesn't get implemented. So I guess the good practice we've seen is utilities that have like dedicated units or dedicated staff or dedicated budget lines, even if they're tiny, just to make sure that you actually have that accountability and visibility of the service. And I wasn't going to talk about individual partners, but Malindi Water have this amazing internal influencing strategy where every Wednesday everyone had to wear the t-shirt of the pit emptying team and like talk really loudly about fecal sludge management and how brilliant it was as a way of kind of building pride in the service. So kind of addressing that status issue head on and enabling the utility as a whole to feel proud that they're providing sanitation services, which is why CWIS is such a nice term, because you're not saying fecal sludge, or you kind of get away from that idea of disgust and turn it into something which is which you can be really proud of. I guess that's probably the biggest adaptation that we've seen, the most important.
Interesting. Yeah, a good initiative for sure. There's a question. I'm not so sure whether Rohini and Tanvir will be able to respond, but we can give it a try. So there are in Africa and Latin America, there are associations of regulators, right? There's CWIS for East Africa and South Africa, and Adarasa. So there's a question from Batsirai, whether you think there's interest in having a similar platform for regulators in South Asia.
I think it's a bit too early to tell. We don't have a regulator at the country level yet. So I think if you have regulators operating in different countries in South Asia, maybe there can be an appetite for having an association like ESAWAS or something like that. Yeah, it's too early to tell. I mean, for Bangladesh, actually, yeah.
I agree with him, I think. So there are already so many regulatory bodies involved in most of our sanitation. So probably bringing them into a platform maybe needs some more time to understand, I think. So maybe too early to comment on that, I would say.
All right. Good. So we are approaching the end of this session. I would like maybe to request, well, in the meantime, Professor Christoph, he had to excuse himself. He had another important meeting to attend. So I would like to ask the four speakers to maybe in 1-2 minutes or to just highlight a little bit the key takeaways from this session when we're looking at strengthening integrity within CWIS. It can be in your context, it can be from your experiences. Like, what do you think people here listening in should take away from this session when it comes to your presentation? So whoever wants to start, just unmute yourself and we are ready.
Can I start just in case someone else says this before me? I have to think of something else. So I think like public finances for public services, you know, sanitation is such an essential public service. It has to be resourced in that way.
Yeah.
I think mine would be about understanding kind of shadow systems. I think we've got really good at kind of developing the tools to kind of understand the visible system, what constitutes good regulation, what do we expect to see, understanding kind of the layer beneath that, what's happening in the background. I think that's a really important takeaway for me. I don't think we've necessarily got that understanding yet. Once we've got that understanding, I think we can move the next step forward in terms of developing the interventions, the materials, the resources to begin addressing lots of these challenges.
Makes sense. Rohini?
So I do agree with both of them what they're talking about. I think the integrity will bring in with all the stakeholders once there is a trust building, once there is affordability to it. So I think with the resource providing much more resource, I think the CWIS will also become one of the key planning tool in the service delivery, I feel.
Yeah, I think all the takeaway points are taken, but yeah, sanitation is a service, and we have to get our mindset into that. And like any other service, it has to be regulated. And so sanitation service delivery also has to be regulated in whatever means that it be, whether it's in a city or small town or whatever. And I think the CWIS concept has basically put all these things forward in front of us in a cohesive and an organized way. So I think there's the regulations would be easier to adopt, or the uptake would be good if we follow the CWIS framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanvir. And I think you have summarized pretty well what my closing remarks were going to be. So we talked today about CWIS. We understand what's new, what's not so new, but it's basically, somebody said it's a mindset, it's a change of mindset, it's a new concept, which will allow us to act more coordinated, more comprehensively, to look at the broader, let's say, sanitation system in urban areas. I think from our side, we are interested to continue in these conversations. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's a new topic for us. We have lots of upcoming work in the next year. We've concluded a mapping of the integrity risks in the sanitation chain. Now we are looking at regulatory frameworks in Zambia, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Bangladesh, trying to understand how strong these regulatory mechanisms are and how can they be improved. And then sky's the limit. I mean, we want to continue these conversations, and if you are interested, and since you're here, and we imagine you are, we will keep you up to date with the conversation, with the work, and for sure there will be other opportunities to join this type of work. Having said this, so Claire, Rohini, Bill, Tanvir, and Christoph, we would like to thank you very, very much for being here, sharing your expertise. And to the rest of the people online, thank you very, very much. And until next time.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.